No Australian Prime Minister has kept a promise to reduce migration this century. On 18 July 2010, then Prime Minister Julia Gillard said Australia should not hurtle down the track towards a big population. In financial year 2010-11, when Prime Minister Gillard made that statement, migration did drop from 196,000 to 180,000. But then in the next 2 years, it soared to top 230,000 each year. Similarly, population growth dropped from 340,000 to 308,000, but for the next 2 years it topped 390,000. Despite the Prime Minister's undertaking, migration and population went up, not down. Prime Minister Gillard had to deal with the belligerent opposition and crossbench, and she can rightly blame them for the increase in irregular maritime arrivals. But she cannot blame them for frustrating bills that would have reduced the skilled family reunion and international student visas, because she did not bring any to Parliament. That is, she did not even attempt to. The Prime Minister had expressed concern about the size of the population. The only part of the population she could significantly influence was migration. She had led the public to believe she would lower migration, but let it increase. On 18 November 2018, giving the Bradfield oration, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison said he would lower migration because he heard that people were concerned about population and the clogging of infrastructure like schools, roads and public transport. But the action he took was to reduce the permanent migration intake cap to the level of permanent visas that were being issued anyway. It turned out to be a reduction from about 163,000 to 160,000. To compound the deceit, the tiny reduction occurred with respect to the permanent migration intake, which actually has limited effect on the population because some permanent visas are issued to temporary residents already living in Australia and already using schools, roads and public transport. As The Guardian reported, while the government will lower the cap from 190,000 to 160,000, in practical terms it actually delivers close to status quo. Australia accepted 162,417 permanent migrants in the last year, unquote. Prime Minister Morrison spoke to the grievances of Australia's commuters, parents and students and linked migration reductions to that. But the action he took did not actuate migration policy in a way that would address those concerns. He made an undertaking to lower migration and did not fulfil it. On 12 December 2021, then leader of the opposition Anthony Albanese was reported to have refused to back the then government's proposed increase of the permanent migration intake to 160,000 after the borders reopened. He also argued that while migration is important, the government should instead focus on training Australians who are unemployed or underemployed, unquote. This indicated that he would favour labour over capital in migration settings in a way he saw the coalition not doing, indicating, again, a lower migration intake. There were no other statements made by the then opposition to reverse the concern they expressed at having permanent migration at 160,000. However, rather than reducing the permanent intake below 160,000, at the September 22 Jobs and Skills Summit, the Albanese government announced an increase in the permanent migration intake to 195,000 in 2022-23, and it currently is 185,000. While Mr Albanese's inconsistency between his words and actions were less stark than that of Prime Ministers Gillard and Morrison, it was an inconsistency and it did mislead the public. Prime Minister Albanese's record on migration is complicated by the pandemic. It was an unprecedented time. It is realistic that the government could make an error in good faith in managing the migration program in this time. It is also important to note that the full transcript of Prime Minister Albanese's comments in News Corp were not available, at least to me. It is entirely possible that he added context, caveats and qualifications to his comments that mean my assessment of him having undertaken to lowering the permanent migration intake below 160,000 is incorrect. Certainly, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese broke the undertaking he gave if it was correctly reported by News Corp. Given the lack of clarity around his comments, I stand to be corrected that he did undertake to lower migration, so did not fail to fulfil that. However, even on this charitable reading of events, it can at least be said that he did not fulfil any undertaking to lower migration, even if that occurred because no such undertaking was given. 2 and arguably 3 undertakings have been given to reduce migration by Australian political leaders who have been or gone on to be Prime Ministers, yet none have been fulfilled. The only significant migration reductions outside of the pandemic in the 21st century were done under Prime Ministership of Kevin Rudd, who had not made an undertaking to reduce migration. There is a major disconnect between our politicians' undertakings to reduce migration and the fact they never fulfill them. Politicians appear to be trying to reconcile the irreconcilable desires of big business for high migration and the public for low migration. Their actions make sense as an effort to say things about migration levels that please the public, but do things about migration levels that please big business. To know what the migration policies will be if our Prime Ministers stay in office and if our leaders of the opposition take office, their rhetoric is unfortunately of limited use. The better insight is to look at what they did when last in office. Outside of the pandemic, the last coalition government ran a migration system that delivered net overseas migration of 241,000 in 2018-19, while the last Labor government unaffected by the pandemic ran a migration system that delivered 230,000 in 2012-13. Labor and Liberal are not all the same. There are significant differences. They just do not manifest in migration policy. Their record on migration levels are indistinguishable, as sadly is the insincerity of their rhetoric on migration. We should be sceptical of political promises to reduce migration. If you agree, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, you can like and share it and subscribe to our channel. There's also an accompanying essay which is available on our Substack, and there's a link to that in the description. You can also follow us on TikTok and Twitter, where we're at LowMigrationAU. Thank you.